Hi, my name is Ekta and I'm a group product manager at Sharechat. Today I'm going to talk about data and experimentation at scale. But before we get there, I just want to talk a little bit about my journey. So I started my career in 2007, did my bachelor's in computer science. And after that, I got interested in game theory, microeconomics, and ended up pursuing a master's in maths and economics. And for a good 8 to 9 years after that, my work largely has been in and around data science applications in consumer internet. The year before last, I ran a company which was into B2B edtech, wasn't a commercial success. And after that, I figured out that I needed to learn how to build better products, which is what I'm going to talk about. This role that I'm doing right now actually has taught me how to actually integrate like a systems thinking and the discipline of product into building great products. So we'll talk about experimentation at large, but before that I just want to draw a boundary about the difference really between enterprise and consumer products, because I think that's really where building great products really starts from. So when we talk about enterprise products, right, a lot of people say that enterprise products really are like demowares, and the reason people say that is because when you're actually sitting with the sales agent, they really mirror how a decision maker wants to see the product, as opposed to the products being built for an end user. And really, I think the differentiation is important because the way that builders, your engineers, your product org, all of the org inside that, thinks about building and experimenting with the product really is dependent on how the product is sort of sold, how you do innovation, how there are feedback loops, so on and so forth. Now, if we actually then contrast it with respect to consumer internet, so what I mean by consumer internet are things along, let's say, retail applications, where a lot of users are using your product day in and day out, right? And by a good byproduct of how that product would be scaled, it needs to bake in some kind of feedback loops and habit formation, because it is extremely important for the product discovery. The kind of network effects that you will plan and plant in your product really depends on that. Which gets me to the most important distinction, right? Which is, if you really have to scale consumer internet products from a growth mindset, it really has to implant large-scale experimentation to be able to scale that innovation through the feedback that your users are giving you. So first things first, right? Like, why experiment at all? And when I say this in the context of consumer internet. So the core thesis is that if we, let's say, talk about hypothetical product, or let's say Sharechat, right? Let's say if you're talking about 100 million DAO product. So different users, let's say across the entire India, like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, they essentially experience your product very, very differently. And because they experience your product very differently, it basically introduces two things that you have to solve for. So the first is, how your users actually discover the product, like parts of the product, and really understanding where the users get stuck and understanding why they do what they do. The best example I can think of is, one of the anecdotal cases when we were looking at the data, and there was this case about a few group of users who were actually signing in, as much as 25, 30 times in an app. Now imagine, it's one single day, one app. Think about it much like a Facebook, right? Because that's a more globally recognized construct that you can think about. What we figured out was that these users were actually going and checking the profile of people. And the key finding there was that they were actually going and checking the profile of people that they wanted to talk to, in the construct of a chat room, etc. Now, the reason why that is important is if you were designing your product around a significant cohort for that, you would want to understand, the reason why they are doing these kind of behaviors. So that's the first point, which is around discovering and optimizing some of these micro behaviors, because your users are not like one monolith, right? There are pockets of these users or cohorts that you are actually building value, bottoms up from. So that's the first one. And the second point, which is actually linked to this, is that traditionally in enterprise products, we think about value-based pricing, meaning you have your tiers, right? So tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, which is usually gotten by your sales folks actually thinking about what makes sense and working backward in an Excel or macros, etc. But in consumer internet, which is where experimentation really is the key, you really have to discover how is it that your users perceive the value. So for example, going back to the chat use case of people signing in multiple times in the app, if you figure out that if you had to market a superior chat product that you could monetize, how would you monetize? Because that would become one key offering that customers would be able to pick up, much like how they currently pick up an a la carte. Let's now talk about metrics, and this gets thrown a lot in all of your experimentation product and consumer internet products. One of the key things is that people think, if you have a metric and you have a numerator and denominator and you divide them, there's some ratio that's going to show up. Pretty recently, my thought system on this was extremely challenged. So this is a framework from Phil. Very highly encouraged for you to check it out, and I like the beauty of it. So the beauty of this is that no matter what your product is, it could, by the way, as well be an enterprise product, right? So it applies in both the scenarios. So imagine you have a product, and there's this huge mass of users that could potentially use your product. And you first start with the users that have never used your product, right? So that's the first circle that we're talking about. From that, they would actually discover your product through marketing, etc., and they become the first-time users. Now, a very critical thing happens with this first-time users, right? So imagine there are 3 tiers in your product. So from the first-time users, they go either to a high-value users or to a low-value users, or they go to an inactive users. And this is not a static set in stone kind of a thing, but between these states also they keep moving. So your goal really, as a product manager or as a builder, engineer, whatever that profile is to actually, move your users from inactive or low value users to a high value users. And the loops that you see here basically are saying that, hey, they are pretty much satisfied. But that is something that very rarely happens. Let me give a little more deep dive into what I mean by this, right? So let's say if you were doing your experimentation, going back to the chat use case that I spoke about, and if you figured out that there was something that you could do to nudge these users where they were going on and signing in the app. Now, they're signing in the app because they're interested in somebody's profile, right? Much like maybe in a dating construct, maybe, in an information sharing context, whatever that context is. And if your product could maybe send custom notifications to these users. So that is one way, a very simple way for you to imagine from a mental model perspective that you've taken what these users value the most and then you've planted it in the product for this set of users. So that's that. Now let's talk about the anecdotes of, some anecdotes about how your users actually see the product and contrast it with respect to the chat example that I just gave. So this example is like a personal example that I just experienced a few days back. So this comes from a trading crypto app. It's called Bitsgap. And what essentially this offering is doing is that it has broken it into standard 3 tiers that I was talking about in the enterprise construct, right? So there's a basic, there's advanced, there's pro. But the real challenge here is that when the value is seen from the user, and this is a financial product, there are key things that actually govern how the risk will be mitigated. And in this case, that is maybe features like a trailing up and trailing down. What that means is, let's say when your price is actually changing multiple times a day or the markets is changing, a trading bot product essentially is supposed to help do that for you, right? I mean, without you actually being physically, sort of monitoring and, the entire risk frontier that you think about when you use these products. But the problem in this is that there is no way in which it is going to let a user experiment with the full functionality of the product, right, without you directly jumping on to, for example, pro or even advanced, right? And that's an important distinction because it's not just the $70 that we're talking about, but because if users have to experience the product for a reasonable amount of time, they have to experience the value in its fullness. So that's really how, the second point that I was talking about, which is how do you curate that business value and put it in the hands of users as they experience the product. So let's now talk about what kind of experiments really that you can run in the construct of your consumer internet products, right? So the first and the most obvious one is pricing experiments, which I just spoke about. So, if you were building a chat product for these set of cohorts, you would maybe push them like virtual gifting, the people that they like or to interact with or they feel connected to in the construct of community. You would potentially build some features for that, and then you would capitalize on that. So that's the pricing example. Then you can think of the stack related experiments, right? So in the stack you would have things like front end and back end. So front end usually will be things that you touch and feel, so things like usability. So for example, if you have screens, and then from within the screens, if you are doing a top down kind of navigation versus you are doing a left swipe or a right swipe kind of navigation. Or for example, things that touch upon design. So for example, the look and feel of the icons and what it speaks to you as a user. So for example, WhatsApp as a product, at least in the construct of India and globally, has very defined icons. So how do you use the iconography and actually superimpose it for the clarity? Now, the experiments that you would run here would then be, hey, if I use a certain design versus another design, and if I use a certain order of this design, how does the user think? A very simple example which we actually experimented out at Sharechat was, if we wanted users to spend more and more time in the app, should we put the share button more closer to the right versus to the left? Because there is a mental model of users actually doing the first action that they see, right? But that's not always set in stone, because users also have these patterns that they're not reading from left to right, but then they have these mental models about how they interact with other products around. So really it depends on what is your user persona, what are these cohorts, what are the kind of products you think that they use, and what are the things that you think that they do, which actually reduces the amount of learning that they have to do in your specific product. And largely, I think all of that front end theme actually ties to the information layout and the fact that you are actually competing in an attention economy, and how do you actually build your products accounting for the fact that you give the power back to the user. Let's talk about the backend. So in the backend, most of the experiments really will be about algorithms generally, right? So there will be n number versions of personalization. So personalization is like, I like something, and can this particular product figure out from my past action that I like or I have an affinity towards certain things. And in that kind of affinity frontier, can it figure out to what extent it wants me to explore new things versus it wants to exploit the information that it already knows about me. So imagine this is an algorithm that has a dial or a knob, and at any point of time you're able to change that dial, and then you're able to move the user from one frontier, which is maybe like an exploit frontier, which is what we know about the user, and then there are a couple of things that we don't know about the user, and then we get that. That distinction in particular is important, because if you want the users to continually experience different parts of your product, or for your product to stay as relevant, you will have to expose them to different to some of these different frontiers. And one way to expose them to different frontiers is for you to deliberately think about some of these dials that I just spoke about. Couple other examples. So one is dwell time, where you're actually looking at how users are actually doing things inside of your product. So for example, if you're using like a feed product like a LinkedIn or a Facebook or Sharechat, users give or drop a lot of these subtle cues in the app. So for example, when they swipe something very quickly and then they swipe back up, it's actually telling you that was something that picked the attention of the user. So can you actually then think about using and instrumenting some of those signals and putting them back for developing some of the algorithmic interventions that I spoke about. Couple other examples here could be things like heat maps. So for example, if you know that users are largely using touch around certain parts of the app, that could be top up, or it could be towards the right, what you would do is that the actions that you want this group of users to take, they would really become dynamic, right? For you to actually expose them to new features or new functionality within the app. And the last one, which is actually pretty interesting, but not a lot of people think about it, is that the things that people do and the things that people don't do, right? Both of them are equally important. So for example, imagine you get n number of notifications from any app every single day, right? And most of these users actually they just swipe off the notifications, because that's the common thing that they do. But in some cases, they actually open the notification and then they look, they zoom out the image, and then they're interested. Those are the places where your product actually has to shine through. And the way it would shine through is through some of the experimentations that we are going to talk about. And it's important because if you're thinking about your experimentation in this construct, it will really help you avoid unnecessary feature gloats, and the way that you would do your product investment would become a lot more data driven. What we're going to do is now, let's say part 2 of this, right, which is take you through a journey of a simple experiment, add a couple of hooks around that simple experiment, and take you through the flow of what does it take to actually build a very simple framework for actually experimenting. So this is an experiment that I ran back at Sharechat. This is called interest selection. So the problem is, let's say you've just installed the app right now. We know nothing about you because you've not interacted with the app so far, right? So I don't know what you like, what your categories, etc. are. So this experiment is actually trying to find a way in which it can extract the nearest interests that you are most certainly going to like. So that's the idea. And the way we do any of this is there are multiple objectives here. So the first objective is for you to figure out what are these categories that the user that would be representative of the entire set of users, but at the same time they're not very common, right? Because for example, if you do something like, so obviously this is an illustration, but let's say if you were doing something like a very common of beauty and style, it means different things to different people. So the objective then you're solving for is, do I go broad, meaning it's beauty and style, or do I go sort of narrow, which is, let's say, Kolhapuri chappals, right? So you're actually like sort of defining, and obviously there's a trade-off because not a lot of people will actually like some of these narrow categories, and this is something that you maybe want to like sort of help them experiment further down the line, but not at the sort of the landing page, if you would. So there are 3 parts to this. So the first is the part that I said about front end, which is the layout and the actual copy that you want to persuade users to, because you're explaining to a new user who's experiencing your product what that copy actually means and what would happen if they actually interact with this part of your product. The second is the back end, which is where your logic for, do I need to go broad in my categories or do I need to go narrow? And let's say if I figure out that beauty and style is a master category, how do I then expose the user to be able to capture L1, L2, L3, like further narrow down categories, so that those set of users are able to discover that kind of content and their needs are much better served. And the third and the most important, which goes back to the point that I was making earlier, is about inactions. So when people, for example, do things like continue or close or they just exit, really what you're looking at in the construct of experimentation is how you think about your funnel, because that is not something that you look after you bring up the experiment. That's something that you think before. You model for it, you using the existing data, and that's how you will be able to put what I call as a full-blown variant matrix to have some numbers around what to expect when the users are actually experimenting within or experiencing your particular product. And one way to think about is that all of this, think of all of this as a framework, and that framework is actually getting amplified by a lot of things inside the company. So one key pillar to that is the UX research, which is where you would work with your product designers, and they would actually help you narrow down the space of what categories to pick up, what candidates, etc., to actually expose here. And the second would be the second pillar would be any kind of behavioral stuff that you know from your users quantitatively. And the third is what you think you know qualitatively about the experience of the users in their first contact with the product right after this. So let's talk about one of this variant, just for us to see what is it that we are experimenting on. And I think this will actually fundamentally change the way that you experience the products that you love. So this is a simple example where, let's say you're talking about a feed product, and within the feed there are these different posts or assets. When you click on one of this, the first screen that you see has some things on the top on the right, and then it has a few elements on the at the bottom, right? And each of these things that you see, right from your design, your iconography, the order of these, likewise what part of that caption that you're reading and how do you read it, whether it has tags, whether it has an extended description, all of that is actually something that you experiment, and all of that will have many downstream actions that we're going to speak about. So let's do a deep dive in the variant metrics. So one of the key things that I feel that when you're building products in large scale experimentation that we need to do first is to actually define the scope of entropy, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that are actually moving in each of these variants. So the first thing is you would basically figure out, back in the front end and the back end and the inactions that I spoke about, right? How do you want to divide this? So this is one simple example where you have one dimension, which is the layout of the screen. Are you going to show it in a full or is there a see-through element behind? Whether you have coach marks or auto scroll and things like that. Then the choice of your categories, which is what I'm talking about, L0 categories, so which is the broadmost categories, and then you have maybe sub categories or what I call as L1 categories, and then how your skip and close or submit and continue buttons look, feel and behave like, whether they're disabled and things of that kind. In this construct, let's talk about a few learnings in particular. So I said that the most important thing is not just for you to capture what the user selected and what was displayed to them, but also what they actually ignored. Because I think that if you're talking about, let's say, 100 million DAO products, what you can learn very, very quickly is when you look at what your users actually ignore. And in this construct, let's say, there was something that that you showed them, but that was maybe below the fold, right? So they didn't even scroll through. And it's important because, then you don't end up making wrong inferences about the fact that there was not a strict preference. So in economics broadly, we say there's all the set of these experiments or all the set of these choices that users could select from, much like a la carte. But if you did not give a user a certain choice, or if that choice was not seen by the user, it's not one versus the other. And the reason why that is important is because at some point in the journey, you may want to reactivate what was actually ignored by the user, because otherwise, as a product manager, you would be actually measuring and instrumenting for the wrong things. So that's on the defining the entropy. Then you define what kind of data as a construct of this that you want to capture. How do you want to capture it in terms of all the tables and backend infra and so on and so forth. How do you plan and instrument your QA testing, because these are different variants, and within the variants there are a lot of moving parts that you're trying to test for. You will obviously ensure that when you bring this experiment out live, that there's a reasonable holdout, that each of these variants has sufficient critical mass, because otherwise essentially what you are doing is that you have a plethora of all of these variants and experiments, but then none of them actually have a critical mass, meaning you would not be able to conclude that any of these experiments has actually reached that critical mass. And obviously you would also want to think about, are these new behaviors that I'm expecting my users to know or to do? In which case you would think about, how do I teach these behaviors as effectively as possible and use things like coach marks, etc. Now, all of this brings together basically what I call as an effective experimentation design when seen from the lens of a user, and we'll talk about the back end and things like that shortly. So just a recap. So far what we have spoken about is, we have spoken about a simple experiment and all the setup, instrumentation, all of that you need. Now let me actually just make you appreciate how complicated large experimentation products really are. So imagine again, you're seeing your feed on Sharechat, on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, whatever the product that feels natural to you. And it's not one algorithm, right? So imagine that each of these algorithms are actually vying for the attention that they want to get from you as a user. So think about an objective function, which is when new posts come in the system, we call them as fresh posts, or it needs to actually get a reasonable amount of exposure. So that is one algorithm. The second is, because I don't know much about you as a user, can I give you exposure to what I feel most of the people would like, which is what we call as popular posts. Or for example, there are users like you or posts that you've liked in the past. Can I do some kind of a collaborative filtering and expose to you that kind of content? Trending posts or breaking news, which is around temporal content, because in this case you are solving a problem where you're taking the content high, right, because it's a breaking news, but after a while it would lose its relevance. So being able to first detect that it is living right now that period of relevance from a temporal perspective. Obviously in this, because you are also monetizing, you will have to figure out, hey, what kind of ads do I bake in, when do I show, what category of ads, so on and so forth. You would think about things like explore versus exploit. So for example, if you have to expose them to new categories or new parts of the app, new kind of content, etc., or new clusters, you could potentially think about what is it that users have previously engaged with, or what is it that users have previously searched from, and you would try to see what is the new frontier that I can take these users that is sort of like related but not like completely orthogonal. So you're sort of optimizing for that, and obviously you would look at different kind of affinity algorithms or different kind of content, because the content would be a video content, an image content, and each of these, I mean, essentially what you're optimizing for is you're optimizing for attention of the user, and realistically, you know, things like time spent and retention and the fact that they come multiple times in the day or multiple times, you know, the course of the week and the month, etc. I'll just take an example of a budget pacing or a min views example here. To make us realize that, you know, it is not a one user affecting or getting affected by the system, and I think this is a very beautiful, it's a simple but a very beautiful example of that. So we use pacing experiments in multiple constructs. In past, you know, out at my role at InMobi, which is a mobile advertising, you know, in terms of the product. We had these budget pacing experiments. So what we used to do was we had to define if you're given a certain budget from an from an advertiser, how do you want to pace it so that you're getting a mix of the users, because essentially if you get a mix of the users, you've helped, you know, that advertiser reach a larger mass or more relevant mass of the users, as opposed to, you know, just burning out the budget maybe during the day or during the month, so on and so forth. MinViews sort of follows the similar construct. Like I said, your goal here is there are fresh posts that are coming in the system, and when these fresh posts come in the system, you want to figure out what is the most effective way of actually giving the exposure of these fresh posts to users. So imagine you have a stream of posts. These posts are posted by user 1, user 2, user 3 up to user n. This is happening right now as we speak. So a lot of posts are coming right now. I, as the first user, which is the user 4, I have an affinity towards the category or the genre or, you know, the type of the post. If it's a video post and I like, you know, engaging a lot with video posts, right? So essentially a simple algorithm, what it's doing is that it is finding this person related affinity, and then it's actually trying to optimize from within this, meaning what parts of these posts should I actually show to the user 4. But the most important or interesting part of this is the action that you've just taken on user 4. Meaning, you know, you've just shown a certain post to this user, and the action that this particular user takes will actually have much far downstream effects on what happens to the journey or the life cycle of that post. And what I mean by that is, let's say if you were shown a post from, let's say, an influencer, etc., and because you saw the post, you liked it, and now when you liked it, that post will now be seen by n number of other users. So essentially it's not like one thing versus other. And oftentimes, you know, this has far outreaching effects for the actors on the platform. So for example, if your algorithm, you know, is sort of like biased towards a few of these parameters, essentially you are teaching your users to gamify the system, where maybe they would make users to actually click or do certain actions to maybe create misleading content, right? Because that's how they are able to reverse engineer what your product is actually doing for them. So experimentation setup in general is extremely nuanced. Many ways to actually, you know, just do deep dive on each of those sections. But I thought I'll just bring everything together, apart from, you know, the two examples that we have just taken. So the first part that I said was the entity, meaning who is it that you are experimenting on. So you are maybe experimenting on a user, and the only thing that you are experimenting actually just affects the user. In most of the products, actually this never really happens unless, you know, it's a very simple change that only affects that particular user. The most common one is when what I as a user do, right, it also affects others. So self versus others. And the third is, you know, a group of people, the action that they do also affects a group of other people. So this would be examples such as, you know, communities and groups and things of that kind. The second key pillar here is what I call as assignments, meaning how do you want to take these users or the entities right now and you want to assign them to these different experiments. And you could experiment with respect to defining nuanced cohorts, meaning, you know, if they've done K transactions, let's say in a ride sharing app, people who take ride every single day, or people who take rides, let's say at least 3 times a week, that would be, let's say, one sort of cohort. Or people who are actually inactive, meaning, you know, possibly they have their own, either they don't commute or they have their own commute vehicle, and they only take your ride sharing app when you are traveling, right? And then there are the static attributes of the entity, meaning if you want to experiment with the user, what is the language that you want to experiment on? This could be Hindi, English, etc. What kind of platform do you want to experiment on? iOS, Android, etc. The third key part of this is how you want to do this setup. So you have users, you put them in assignments, and then how do you want to test them? So testing is a pretty nuanced concept. So you could have things like a normal where you actually put them in a time window, and then the experiment sort of runs for a number of days and you're done, right? Two constructs here would be things like switchback tests. So what you do in this is you put a user in a group, and then you are actually taking the user out, and then you are assigning them in some other variant, or you're turning back. The reason why this is important is because for the same control and user, essentially what you're doing is you're doing time slicing kind of experiment. The second use case here is what I call as partition graphs. So the example that I just showed you on the min views, because it's not a linear way to experiment, and it has a lot of downstream effects. So the way that you would want to partition your graph would be, all of these users that have now gone, you would potentially have a tier 1 or metrics for the first set of users or the first set of entities that got exposure to that particular experiment, and then there would be a tier 2 metrics which are maybe for the downstream users that get, or actors that, or entities that get impacted, and the third would be, let's say, users that potentially get. So you can go any level steep, but really the most important point is what is your base understanding of this network graph, because a lot of these consumer internet products that we are seeing actually have a lot of these network effects, and it's important for us to take the feedback from those. I'll come to the last part of this presentation. So this is a roadmap that we follow out at Sharechat, and the reason why I find this is pretty interesting is because it helps you think over a period of time, what is it from a competency point of view that you want your company to be in the construct of a consumer internet, and which is where experimentation fits in very, very beautifully. So I talk about it in terms of 4 layers, and we'll get into each of the 4 layers. So the first layer is what I call as core platforms, which is where you would have all of your instrumentation, Play Store releases, things of that kind. The second layer is what I call as data layer, which is where all of your data that is basically going to come from your client is actually sitting via your streaming systems, and then it's processed. It has these aggregates that you're able to query on, and obviously when you have these aggregates, you are able to do things like query management, scheduling, and things break, so on and so forth. So that's what I call as the data layer, and in this case obviously you will have to have nuances around how do you want to treat the access control and PII information, and what kind of certifications or compliance initiatives would also fit in that. So that's what I call as a data layer. The third layer, which is where the meat actually is what I call as the actual experimentation layer. So you would have things like plug and play modules, like if you want to do stratified sampling, how do you want to look at your user cohorts? How do you want to have your rule engines to be able to define these user cohorts on the fly? So for example, one simple example of a user cohort could be users who who share a lot of content, or users who consume a lot of content passively, right? And you've sort of defined them on the fly, and because you've defined them on the fly, you are then able to run your experiments only on these defined cohorts, and within that obviously you will also have your controls, etc. Because experimentation is extremely complex, you would also have things like root cause analysis, and how do you generate new hypotheses at scale, how do you detect things like bias, and how do you remediate things that are sort of broken. So that will be a set of tools that you do largely to be able to increase the velocity and the confidence of your experimentation in your setup. Then things like other applications that you would build, which would be how do you release your application out, or how do you do your rollouts to be able to control for which kind of users get access to what. The fourth part of this is what I call as pod-centric applications. So experimentation largely is a horizontals initiative, And on top of this horizontal initiative, imagine you have a marketplace where whatever set of these applications your end consumers, which is inside the company, end up using, let's say things like figuring out how much of a drift has actually happened in a supply or a demand, right? What kind of content that you feel you want to see, what are these content clusters that are actually shaping the way users interact. So those kind of pod centric and journey differentials, etc., would come in. And then along with that, because you have you're sitting on a lot of data, you would actually enrich and package all of this data, and then you would build out your revenue capabilities. But just take a pause and think about, we spoke a lot about the value and debugging and monitoring, and then you are actually building your revenue streams. And in this construct, obviously your revenue streams would be along ads and things of that kind. So final recap, like bottoms up, if you think about it, it's you have an experimentation setup, you take your experiments live, you spend a lot of effort, time in debugging. I think that's actually the critical missing link in most of the setups. I feel like a lot of people give up just at that, and then we fall in the suboptimal, running suboptimal experiments because of that. You would have your monitoring, alerting, dry run kind of infra where you're able to simulate and be able to approximate what you should be seeing as an output to this particular experiment. And then you would measure your experiment, the results of your experiment, you would visualize it, you would make the decisions, you would socialize those. And largely, I think the last part is around, how do you get this culture of experimentation? Because I think tools are just one part, but the culture mindset of how deep you want to get in terms of running that experiments, either it is from partitioning the graph and so on and so forth. I think that's the key part. So yeah, that's all that I have for today. Thank you so much.